Last year, I released a series of videos centered around build crafting around the Crota's End Day 1 raid race. This year, I wanted to use some of the new knowledge that I've learned over the last few seasons in order to take a more measured approach to Day 1 build crafting. Specifically, I want to focus on 3 questions that I feel are most pertinent to a contest mode raid race. First, what are the circumstances that affect the viability of certain loadouts this upcoming raid race? Second, what are the common components of an effective Day 1 build? And finally, how can we use this knowledge to create team compositions or loadouts that encompass all of these components to achieve success? This video will focus on that first question. Going into the final shape, we have an unprecedented amount of sandbox tweaks and new options compared to the last couple of races. Under normal circumstances, I'd make separate videos about the new exotic armor, the new supers and aspects, the weapon meta changes, prismatic and transcendent, and the artifact, but since we're pressed on time, I'm going to compress all of that into this video, since all of it is relevant to Day 1 build crafting. We start with weapons. First, let's take a look at primaries. Since primaries are primarily used for ad clear, I'm going to refer to another specialist in the damage department, Mossy Max. Thanks to him, we have 2 charts that display the highest DPS primaries when it comes to dealing with minors, or red bars, and elites. Pay attention to the blue dots here. They signify primary DPS accounting for reloads, but with max reloads and a reload scaler. As you can see, pulses, autos, hand cannons, and sidearms are the top contenders for red bars, with the last 2 being standouts against elites. However, in a Day 1, sidearms tend to have range issues. Plus, you can use rocket sidearms instead, which share the champion mod slot. Therefore, my 3 recommendations this upcoming race for primaries are going to be the first 3 I mentioned. Additionally, you may have noticed a series of yellow dots on Mossy's charts as well. Those depict exotic primaries, which now inherit a 30% damage bonus to minors rather than the 40% they used to. In this category, I'd like to recommend Outbreak Perfected, Necrochasm, and Revision 0 in the kinetic slot, as well as Graviton Lance and Collective Obligation in the energy slot. Cerberus +1 and Final Warning also probably deserve some testing, but they wouldn't be my first choices in a Day 1 scenario. For specials, which tend to be more damage focused, let's move to my damage spreadsheets. Here, I've temporarily set aside tabs for the most relevant special and power weapons, scaled with the final shape adjustments. For special weapons, we're looking for ammo-efficient ad-clear weapons, major burst weapons, and boss DPS weapons. In my opinion, those are still going to be wave frames and rocket sidearms for the first group, with high blast radius and volt shot being priorities on the former and latter respectively. As for majors, Recombination Succession and Heritage are still great choices, as is Kinetic Tremor Supremacy with its incredible ammo efficiency. Finally, for Day 1 boss damage, total damage and consistency is king. When it comes to the former, 4 times a charm rapid-fire snipers are slot leading. Think about weapons like Supremacy, Irukandji, and Ikelos SR. In a pinch, rocket sidearms also work for proccing something like bait and switch if a boss doesn't have a favorable crit, but a fusion rifle or breach GL might fill this role better if you're willing to swap. Some honorable mentions include Cloud Strike, which has fairly good total damage and DPS but isn't void, which might make it less favorable given the seasonal artifact, Izanagi's Burden for less ammo-sensitive bosses, Witherhoard for chip damage and increasing malfeasance damage for Lucky Pants teammates, and Reworked Bastion for destroying encounter objects with ease, such as Golgoroth Bubbles or Security Fuses. I also want to mention Trench Barrel Aggressive Shotguns as a potential pocket pick in case we have a melee boss and you're out of heavy. Some of these shotguns compete with the likes of Lament when it comes to DPS, all while maintaining favorable total damage as a result of a 50% damage perk. As for power weapons, there's a couple options worth looking at, but nothing too out of the ordinary. For ranged div bosses, I'm going to suggest Whisper of the Worm as the default pick, with Leviathan's Breath being a possibly solid option if the seasonal artifact Void Boost is a strong option. For easy to hit bosses, Edge Transit is an obvious pick with its access to Envious, Bait, and the Void affinity to match. I'm also going to be testing Deathbringer as a potential option, since my current numbers indicate that it might be good even in fireteam scenarios, even accounting for the reduced scaling and issues with projectile tracking consistency. No promises though. For melee bosses, a Legend of Acreus is a pretty decent choice, with Bait and Switch, Frenzy, Falling Guillotine, Light Attack Spam being a solid option even if a boss isn't surrounded. If a boss is surrounded, then whether or not you use Bequest is going to depend on the artifact mod situation, which has yet to be fully revealed. Finally, if we get another A-Track situation, Parasite will obviously be ideal for that. Now that we've established what weapons are most likely relevant in the current field, let's talk about abilities. First, the elephant in the room. Well of Radiance has had its boss damage resistance quartered from 40% to 10%. Additionally, its restoration effect has had its potency reduced from a hit in tier 3, where it healed about half your health per second, to half that at regular tier 2 restoration. We'll talk about this more later, but on the other hand, we also have a couple new damage resistance sources. First, Frost Armor has been added to the game in exchange for the rework of Whisper of Chains. Second, Ward of Dawn now emanates Void Overshield, and this should allow both it and Edge of Action's Mini Dome to provide some additional survivability in boss encounters. Finally, the new Warlock Super Song of Flame also provides damage resistance, which depending on the value of said DR might become a staple pick for doing boss DPS. As for the other new supers, Twilight Arsenal and Storm's Edge, things look a little more grim. Twilight Arsenal, though its damage remains to be seen, doesn't seem to be a particularly viable super for a day 1 scenario, given that part of its effect involves going to pick up axes that are in possibly dangerous locations. Storm's Edge, from the preliminary numbers we've looked at so far, doesn't seem to be competitive DPS wise either. We've also got 3 new aspects to look at, one for each subclass that received a new super. Unfortunately, none of them look very compelling. Hellion, as far as soul aspects go, doesn't seem to have a useful secondary effect, at least as far as we know. Additionally, it's competing with the likes of Heat Rises and Touch of Flame, which, as you probably know, is not a favorable matchup. Unbreakable has some synergy with updated Ursa Furiosa, so it's made its way into one of the builds I'm going to present in later videos, but generally speaking doesn't look to be incredibly strong given that it consumes your grenade for defensive purposes. Finally, Ascension appears to have some unique utility, but it's certainly very situational. By consuming your class ability, assumably not giving you your melee back, you can provide your teammates with Amplified while jolting the enemies around you. Under normal circumstances, Arcstrider definitely prefers to not waste its class ability, but this season's artifact mods, specifically Galvanic Armor, strongly benefit from a quick and easy way to get everyone amplified. More on that later. Before we talk about Prismatic, the other elephant in the room, let's talk about exotic armor. Each class has received 2 new exotic armor pieces alongside the final shape, so let's start with Hunters. Balance of Power and Gifted Conviction are the 2 they got, and while the former slightly enhances Threaded Spectre, Gifted Conviction certainly has my attention between the 2. Even though Threaded Spectre is part of Prismatic Hunter, there are much more useful exotics that synergize better with the kit. On the other hand, in a sandbox that seems to have shifted towards valuing damage resist even more, Gifted Conviction provides heaps of it. Not only does it synergize with Ascension, but it also provides up to 4 stacks of resist, which by previous metrics is around 50%, which is huge. And the price for this much DR, well, it's just simply jolting enemies repeatedly, which can be done using both Ascension and a Voltshot Indebted Kindness. Titans also have some interesting new exotics. Hazardous Propulsion is the talk of the town right now, with its 35% buff to rockets and rocket sidearms after 6 crits or kills, as well as its Exodus rockets, which can passively boost your damage through the activation of your class ability. This exotic definitely needs some testing before we make any more conclusions about it, but keep your eye on it as a potential passive damage increase during boss DPS. Wishful Ignorance has also caught the eyes of some Titan players. Not only does this exotic have the potential to boost both Fleshed Storm and Frenzied Blade damage by 50 and 100% respectively, but it also provides an additional melee charge and melee ability energy every time you heal allies with Banner of War. While this exotic does seem like it's very strong for Berserker Titans, especially those that aren't using grapple melee, Berserker is a bit of a risky play on day 1, and this exotic doesn't look like it will make that any less true. Finally, Warlock. Compared to some of the other Strand exotics, Matiodoxia appears to be fairly strong, especially with things like Weaver's Trance playing into its effects well. However, Broodweaver is notoriously frail in low power content, and Strand's greatest survivability asset, Woven Mail, isn't really modified by this exotic. Last but certainly not least is Speaker's Sight. This exotic's extremely potent effect is twofold. For one, your healing grenades spawn a healing turret at their location, which, to my understanding, essentially shoots 5 mini healing grenades at your allies over the course of 15 seconds. I'm not sure whether or not these splash, but if they do, this will be one of the strongest survivability exotics ever released. Not only does this guarantee tier 2 restoration for 15 seconds, ensuring benevolence uptime and essentially giving you back another grenade, but it also generates orbs for a completely passive effect too. Certainly this will need some testing, but for now it sounds absolutely great, which is why you'll see it in one of my build suggestions. It's time to talk about Prismatic. I'm sure most of you are aware of how Prismatic works, but what I wanted to talk about is the impact that it has on the sandbox, and how Bungie's design decisions influence whether or not certain Prismatic subclasses are viable or not. Essentially, why choose Prismatic over your typical light or dark subclasses? In my eyes, Prismatic has 3 advantages. 1, it decouples many restrictive armor exotics and supers from their respective subclasses. This allows for unique interactions between the specific aspects, grenades, melees, etc. that Bungie has chosen to attach to Prismatic. However, herein lies the first problem. If Bungie chooses excellent and interesting aspects that have legitimately useful synergies, then Prismatic has the potential to become greater than the sum of its parts. However, if Bungie chooses aspects that aren't as potent, then even if you can make unique combinations, they might not actually be useful, as you'll see later. On top of this, Prismatic does introduce parts of other subclasses, but these parts were all obviously designed with the rest of their subclasses in mind. For example, you might get Restoration without a way to extend it via Ember of Empyrean. You might get Duskfield Grenades without their enhanced size or duration from Touch of Winter or Whisper of Durance. As such, Prismatic synergies have to make up for this in some way. They have to offer up something that is so potent, so unique, that the individual abilities in their neutered states are still good enough together to compete. Prismatic also offers up some other features in exchange though. For example, while it does not carry over every good fragment from the other subclasses, it combines some of the important fragments in order to ensure that you still have things to work with. However, I will point out some of the more important fragments like Empyrean mentioned earlier that have been lost in this transition. Prismatic lacks the following: strong melee/grenade regen since Facet of Balance is currently an unknown quantity. Orb generation, think Spark of Amplitude. Timer extensions, think Echo of Persistence or like I mentioned earlier, Whisper of Durance. And some miscellaneous fragments like Ember of Benevolence, Empyrean, Thread of Ascent, Thread of Evolution for Needlestorm damage, and of course Echo of Obscurity for Invis Finisher. As for some of the new fragments Prismatic brings, we have two new light focus fragments in the form of Facet of Balance and Courage. The first, which I mentioned before, gives grenade and melee energy depending on light or dark multi-kills. Courage, on the other hand, provides a new way to do more ability damage to darkness debuffed enemies, which is what I would consider Prismatic's first universal step up over the regular subclasses. The second big potential step up, of course, comes from Transcendence. Along with a plethora of fragments to support its existence, Transcendence provides a variety of benefits that the other subclasses can only get through armor exotics. First, when you cast it, it provides you with 2 grenade and melee recharges, sort of like Apotheosis' Veil. Your grenade is replaced with its prismatic version, which seems okay, but are all DOT effects which need damage testing to evaluate them further. As for your abilities themselves, on top of your initial free recharge, you also get passive ability regen and a Hoyle-like effect where your regen for your grenade is increased if your melee is used and vice versa. Finally, to encourage a more aggressive playstyle, Transcendence currently also gives you an unknown amount of damage resist, a 5% universally stackable weapon damage buff, and increased duration on kill. All in all, pretty good, but we'll have to see how easy it is to become Transcendent as well as how much uptime and usefulness it has by actually playing it and measuring things like DR and ability damage come the release of the final shape. The third thing Prismatic offers to players that the other subclasses do not have access to is exotic class items. These class items take some of the best exotic armor effects, trim their secondary effects, and allow you to run 2 at a time. With Hoyle, Syntheseps, Verities, and other powerful effects available to all, I'm excited to see what this will do to the meta, but from what we know, these will not be available until after the raid race is over, so I won't go too into depth with them, and the builds I recommend won't be including any exotic class items. There are quite a few interesting artifact mods this season that will definitely have at least some measurable impact on the raid race. First, the champion stun mods, though usually not relevant, happen to align with the best primaries this season. We have Anti-Barrier Pulse, although with Radiant Orbs that shouldn't be extremely necessary. We have Unstoppable Sidearm, meaning all of your rocket sidearms will have unstop capability. And finally, we have Overload Hand Cannon and Sword, so that in encounters when you are not running a divinity, you have access to stunning while still using seasonally relevant weapons. As for columns 2 through 4, there are a couple notable mods worth mentioning. Generally, Elemental Siphon is pretty good since you just need to use supermatched weapons to make free elemental objects, and since Solar is generally the defining subclass and super choice in the endgame meta right now, this should be a fairly easy way to get fire sprites using weapons like Sunshot, Adhortative, Darkest Before, Zauli's Bane, and Heliocentric. Void Hegemony will pair incredibly well with weapons like Collective Obligation and Buried Bloodline, so if you're running these weapons, be sure to look out for this mod for free Overshield uptime. Like we mentioned prior, Radiant Orbs makes fragments like Ember of Torches and Facet of Dawn a little irrelevant since you'll always have access to Radiant if you're playing most relevant subclasses, unless you want to use that effect to trigger Ember of Benevolence on Solar. Galvanic Armor sounds like an excellent way to give your teammates a free potentially 30% DR since it shares similar language to Electric Armor from Season of the Deep. In the 5th column, things start to get even more compelling. First, Prismatic Transfer is another repeat mod from Season of Defiance, which provides a 20% empowering buff to allies with a super with a different affinity than yours. However, since this empowering buff didn't stack with the other globals like Well, Radiant, and Lumina, it was neglected back then. Unless this behavior changes, it can safely be ignored. Next, we have Argent Blade, which, if it follows in the footsteps of the Argent Ordnance mod that came before it during this season, should boost sword damage by 15% at the cost of armor charge drain. Will this boost swords into the meta above Edge Transit? No. However, any boss where swords or Acreus are relevant, this will make options like Falling Guillotine and Lament just that much more potent, which for swords is something I would say they sorely need. Speaking of Edge Transit and Falling Guillotine, Expanding Abyss is a mod that increases void damage against weakened enemies, and if you know how common Weaken is against bosses, using debuffs like Tractor and Tether or even Undermining and Dominance, then you know that's free additional damage on any boss you decide to use void weapons on. Finally, we have Shield Crush and Transference. A lot of people are talking about how ability spam builds like Starfire Protocol are going to become more potent with Shield Crush, since you get free grenade regen and damage simply for having Radiant, which is easy to maintain constantly, but we'll have to wait and see just how well it performs. In theory, since Grapple Melee counts as both grenade and melee damage, maybe it gets double buffed by both aspects of this mod, but we'll have to see how things play out once the final shape drops. As for Transference, this mod buffs Transcendent by giving you increased ability damage and a Phoenix Protocol-like effect once it ends based on how many kills you got during its duration. Once again, this mod's viability strongly depends on how good Transcendence is as a whole, so we'll have to wait and see the verdict on that once playtesting concludes. In summary, Elemental Siphon no matter what, Radiant Orbs for permanent Radiant uptime, Galvanic Armor if you need DR, Argent Blade for sword damage, Expanding Abyss for pretty much all damage, Shield Crush for passive ability regen or damage, and finally Transference in case Transcendent turns out to be so strong that its ability damage becomes a serious contender for day 1 DPS. This next Raid Race's sandbox is one of the most interesting yet, with an entirely new kind of subclass being introduced to the game alongside Bungie's most aggressive attempt at shifting the meta in quite some time. Hopefully this video gave you guys a lot to think about and consider when it comes to your weapon, ability, and artifact options going into this next day 1. The next video I make will be on the essential components of a day 1 build, as well as some strong examples of builds that I think are the best to take into the final shape raid. In light of recent events and uncertainties, I will wait to release this video and finalize builds until Prismatic is playable tomorrow. Until then.